Hi everyone, and welcome to the Lesson 15.1 Kites in Triangle Midsegments video. In this video, we're going to talk about quadrilaterals and their important features, and then we're going to focus on one type of quadrilateral known as a kite. So let's get started. A quadrilateral, as some of you already know, is a four-sided figure. So any two-dimensional four-sided figure is known as a quadrilateral. And the way we name quadrilaterals is by writing the word quad and then listing the four vertices of the quadrilateral. So if you look down below, I have the quadrilateral GEOM, and I'm going to show you how to identify the key features of the quadrilateral. Starting with the opposite sides. So GM is one side of the quadrilateral, and its opposite side is the one directly across from it. So I would say GM and EO are opposite sides. But notice how it says list all pairs. So another pair of opposite sides would be GE and MO. Now let's talk about consecutive sides. Consecutive sides are two sides that share a corner. So for example, if I took the side MO, one of its consecutive sides would be GM because they share the corner M. So I would say GM and MO is one pair of consecutive sides. We also have GE and EO. We also have EO and MO. And our last one, GM and GE. Now let's move on to talking about angles. Just like with sides, if you take one angle, the one directly across from it is its opposite angle. So angle G and angle O are opposite angles, as well as angle E and angle M. For consecutive angles, those are the angles that are directly next to each other. So for instance, G and M are right next to each other. Those are consecutive angles. We also have angle G and angle E. We also have angle E and angle O. And lastly, angle M and angle O. The last part says draw the diagonals of this quadrilateral. So I'm going to erase my markings for a second. To draw a diagonal, we start from one vertice and draw a line to its other vertice. That is one diagonal. That's the diagonal GO. And make sure when you're labeling all of your sides and angles, you use the proper symbols. And my other diagonal would go from angle E to angle M. And these are your key features of a quadrilateral. As we now start to focus on specific quadrilaterals, each quadrilateral has its own special properties, and I may use these terms in their definitions, and so you need to know what features I am talking about with each quadrilateral. So the quadrilateral we're going to focus on today is a kite. A kite is a quadrilateral with exactly two distinct pairs of congruent consecutive sides. if you look at the kite I have in part A, and if we used a ruler, you could see that side BC and side CD are the same length. They're congruent to one another, and they're consecutive sides because they share corner C. We can also see that side BA is the same length as side DA. Those two sides are congruent, and they're consecutive because they share vertice A. Similar to this kite, we can also see that these two sides will be the same length, and these two consecutive sides will be the same length. So if we know a quadrilateral is a kite, we can go ahead and put these markings on their two pairs of congruent consecutive sides. Another special thing about a kite is that each kite has one diagonal that will divide the kite perfectly in half. So using a ruler, draw in this diagonal in each of the kites. So there's only one diagonal that cuts it perfectly in half. It's either this diagonal or this diagonal. Which do you all think? Part A or part B, which diagonal cut the kite in half? Hopefully you said the one in part A, because in part B, the top triangle does not match the bottom triangle. So this one is not it. But in part A, this diagonal that I drew, CA, cuts the kite perfectly in half. We already know from the definition of a kite that their consecutive sides are congruent. And from our last chapter, we know that if two triangles share a side, that this triangle is that this side is congruent to itself, because congruence is reflexive. And if you notice, I just made two congruent triangles. Triangle CBA is congruent to triangle CDA. And these two triangles are congruent by SSS, because they have all three sides marked as congruent. And now that I know that these triangles are congruent, I can go ahead and say all of their angles are congruent as well. I know that B, the second letter, lines up with D, the second letter. And since C is the first letter in both, that must mean that the two halves of C are congruent to one another. And that must mean that the two halves of A are congruent to each other as well. And so what this shows us is that kites also have one pair of congruent opposite angles. If you notice, B and D are opposite angles on the kite, and they're congruent to one another. And those are the main properties of a kite. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video are triangle midsegments. A midsegment is a segment whose endpoints are the midpoints of two sides of a triangle. So part D says, look at the triangle below, label the midpoints of AC and CG, point M and N respectively. So if I'm going to find the midpoint of AC, I need to use my midpoint formula. The x of point A is 0, plus the x of point C is 12, and divide by 2. And then the y of point A is 0, plus the y of point C is 24, and divide by 2. 0 plus 12 is 12. 0 plus 24 is 24. 12 divided by 2 is 6, and 24 divided by 2 is 12. So the midpoint of AC is at the point 6, 12. I have to be careful because my graph is counting by 2s. 2, 4, 6, and I go up to 12. I'm going to label that point M. That is the midpoint of side AC. What I would like you to do is pause the video and try to find the midpoint of side CG. So using the same process that I just did, will you pause the video and try to find the midpoint of side CG and then check your work with mine? All right, hopefully you tried to find the midpoint of CG on your own. To start us off, the x of C is 12, plus the x of G is 36, and divide by 2. The y of point C is 24, plus the y of point G is 0, and divide by 2. 12 plus 36 is 48. 24 plus 0 is 24. 48 divided by 2 is 24, and 24 divided by 2 is 12. So I'm going to plot the midpoint at 24, 12, and call that point N. If I draw a line between those two midpoints, that is my midsegment. A midsegment is a segment whose endpoints are the midpoints of two sides of a triangle. So we found the midpoint of two sides of a triangle and connected them, and that is my midsegment. Now we're going to look at why midsegments are special. So looking down at part E, it says the length of MN is, well, luckily since MN is flat, we can count the boxes. MN is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But since I'm counting by 2s, this is going to be 18 units. So once again, it's 9 boxes, but remember, each box is counting by 2s. So that is 18 units. And the length of AG, if I see between A and G, that is 36 units. Now let's talk about the slope. The slope of a perfectly horizontal line is 0. A perfectly horizontal line is flat. It has no rise. It's not steep at all. So the slope of MN is 0, and the slope of AG is 0. I want you to think for a second. What do we know about two lines that have the same slope? What do we know about two lines that have the same slope? Hopefully you remember that if two lines have the same slope, they are parallel. Parallel lines have the same slope. And if you look, MN is parallel to AG. Those are two line segments that are going to go forever and ever without ever crossing each other because they have the same slope. And so in part F, it says, write a conjecture about the midsegment of a triangle. So 1, we know that the midsegment is parallel to the third side of the triangle. And if you look at the lengths, 18 is half of 36. So we know that that midsegment is half the length of the third side of the triangle. So a midsegment of a triangle is parallel to the third side of the triangle, and its length is half the length of the third side. So let's practice this. XY is a midsegment of triangle DEF. Find each measure. All right, XY is my midsegment, which means X and Y are midpoints of their sides. So if DY is 4, that must mean that YF is 4. Obviously not drawn to scale, but let's just pretend that those are both 4 units. So YF is 4 units. And if XE is 6, that must mean that DX is 6 because X is the midpoint. So DX is 6 units. And then according to our conjecture about midsegments, the length of the midsegment is half the length of the third side. So in order to find the length of XY, I have to divide 17 by 2. And that will get me 8.5 units. And that is our video on kites and triangle midsegments. I hope this video helped you understand the key features of quadrilaterals and of kites. Please let me know if you have any questions in class, and I will see you soon.